Good evening and welcome to the Facebook Wednesday evening class from Lindsley Avenue Church of Christ. We're very near the end of a series that began a number of weeks ago, where we are discussing why I believe, essentially a look at Christian evidences with an attempt to do that from scratch. Rather than starting from Genesis 1 or from the Bible, as many of these classes have done that I have been in the past, which certainly can have an appeal and it can be helpful to individuals who are Christians already and not having any doubts about anything. This approach has tried to take the situation where someone is having doubts about their faith or does not believe at all and lead them to a belief that God is real and then that the Bible is the revelation from God after describing what that means and then looking at science and the Bible. It's a different way of doing it. If you're talking to someone who already has doubts about the Bible, probably going to Genesis 1 or some verse in the Bible is not going to be what brings them back and says, "Oh, you're correct. I had no idea what I was thinking." Or if you're talking to somebody who does not believe, that approach usually will not work. So we're all the way at the end. If you're just catching into the class now, jumping in here is going to not give you that full context that I think is really important for this type of discussion. So I would please urge you to go back and look at previous video classes from Wednesday nights and see how we got here, where we are. This evening, we're going to look at Genesis 1 and continue the discussion of its importance in four views. And depending on how long the class goes, may either finish the class by looking at the summary of everything we've talked about or split that into another lesson. We shall see. Stay tuned. So last week, we talked about three of the four views that people bring to a discussion or an understanding of Genesis chapter 1. The first one really was mentioned more simply to be complete. A number of people who do not believe have an atheistic neo-Darwinism view, which says that we are here from a non-purposive series of chance mutations and natural selection, that evolution brought us here. There is no God. And so Genesis is simply story tales like the rest of the Bible. That's certainly a view that unfortunately a large number of people have toward the book of Genesis, but that is not what we're discussing here. We then talked about the idea of theistic evolution. And this approach to Genesis 1, those who believe in this approach would say that God used evolution pretty much as the neo-Darwinists would describe it, to bring life into its present state. To a greater or lesser degree, they might have God actually bringing about the mutations or guiding the evolution, but essentially would have very little empirical disagreements with the Darwinists and the people who are not religious at all who believe in evolution. They therefore would believe that Genesis 1 and much of early Genesis itself, usually chapters 1 through 11, are either mythical, allegorical, or at the very least, very non-literal. Adam and Eve would likely not have been specially created. They may have been primates that were pulled out, more or less adopted, and then infused with spirit and conscience and intelligence. There would probably have been no flood as recorded in Genesis chapter 1. It may vary. I'm not saying any of these things in any way to tar individuals who are theistic evolutionists, but those are generally some of the beliefs. I've run into people who would express any of those beliefs, but it does vary by person. So if you find someone who would say, "I am a theistic evolutionist," don't necessarily jump to conclusions. You can simply ask them, "Well, what do you do with the early part of Genesis?" And likely they would be willing to explain it to you. The third approach toward handling Genesis chapter 1 would be from individuals who would fall into an area I have called here old earth creationism. In this case, people who hold this view would believe that God specifically created life forms, animals, plants, and creative activities throughout past time as God's plan needed it. It would not believe, and that's the important thing to stress here, they do not believe that God used biological evolution, but they do believe that the earth and the universe are much older than several thousand years. So in this case, the difference between view 2, theistic evolution, and old earth creationism is primarily around evolution itself. The theistic evolutionists will believe God used evolution pretty much as described in many of the biology textbooks as how God brought life about. But old earth creationism simply says that God's creative activity was pretty much as you might have expected, but simply was spread over a long period of time. And we've talked about both of those two approaches to handling Genesis 1 in pretty good detail last week. So if you want more detail than that, go back to last week. This approach would believe that the apparent conflict with Genesis 1, in terms of Genesis 1 looking as if, from their point of view, that it was a relatively recent creation and accepting an old age for various things, is addressed through various approaches to dealing with the days in Genesis chapter 1. Somebody who is an old earth creationist likely might hold the gap theory, the day age theory, the divine fiat theory. We talked again about that last week, the framework hypothesis, or other approaches. They would believe that God had created Adam and Eve from the dust of the ground, that the events of Genesis 1 through 11 are historical, including the flood in some manner. If you talk to 50 people, you're likely to get 51 opinions on various things. So you can't always just say this viewpoint will hold to these 13 specific items. And as we discussed last week, some individuals from the past allowed some of these other viewpoints other than viewpoint 4 that we're going to talk about here in a minute. David Lipscomb, for example, in the Gospel Advocate in 1899, and in one of his writings, Questions Answered with Lipscomb and Sewell, endorsed what appeared to be the gap theory. Batsell Barrett Baxter, the head of Lipscomb's Bible department, and the Herald of Truth, and the minister at a large congregation here in Nashville, held that we needed to be aware of these approaches and their strengths and some of their weaknesses, simply pointing that out once again. The fourth major view of the first chapter of Genesis is that it describes the complete creation of the universe, the earth, all presently and formerly living life forms by God during 6 24-hour days only a few thousand years ago. This is the one that I really suspect most of us are all probably familiar. In fact, you may not have been familiar at all, pretty much, with any of the distinctions from the previous slide. The primary basis for this view is the language used in the first chapter of Genesis. This view is the plainest way to read the text of Genesis. If you look at strengths of this view, it is by far the plainest way to read the text of Genesis. You don't need to have an approach such as the day-age theory, the gap theory, framework theory, any of these things that we discussed last week. You simply read the text the way it is. One primary reason that this view is taught or held is that, let's be honest here, if you pick up the Bible and begin reading the first chapter, a creation on successive normal days is the fairly natural conclusion from what you read. This view is not taught to children because it's simplistic or childish, but because the straightforward reading of the texts suggests this interpretation. Strengths of this view. Well, at a deeper level, the word for day that's translated day in Genesis chapter 1 is from the Hebrew word yom. And although this word is used in different ways within the Old Testament, the primary definition is day, meaning pretty much the ordinary 24-hour type of day or 12-hour day if it's talking about morning or evening. This again can reinforce the conclusion that Genesis teaches the creation of the universe in 6 successive days. I hope you noticed I did say the primary definition of day in the Hebrew. There are other ways in which it is used, so it's not an exclusive definition, but the primary one is in fact ordinary, what we would view as days. The conclusion that everything was created only a few thousand years ago is therefore really based upon the length of the recorded genealogies and the previous conclusion that the universe is at most 5 or 6 days here older than humanity. We talked a bit about the genealogies, but you're not going to see the genealogies and shove in billions of years in between individuals there in the genealogies. What are some of the problems of this view? Remember, we're trying to look at some strengths and weaknesses, strengths and problems of these different views. We talked about that last week. In terms of the recent creationism a few thousand years ago, as straightforward as the reading of the text seems, this view does have some problems, and we need to acknowledge those, of concern from a scientific perspective. Now, if concerns from a scientific perspective don't concern you or don't bother you, then you really don't have to worry about any of the things that we're going to point out. But if we're talking to someone, remember that we are leading to the idea that God exists from a either unbeliever standpoint or someone who was a believer and now has doubts. I think we need to address these. This view, recent creation a few thousand years ago, 10,000 years, and that's still a rather large percentage difference between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That's an increment of 66%. So that's a pretty wide range percentage-wise. It is in conflict with a host of experimental and observational evidence from many scientific disciplines, not all of which are geology, but includes geology, geophysics, astronomy, astrophysics, cosmology, particle physics, and others. The problem is that these disciplines suggest strongly that the Earth and the universe were created or came into existence. Those from a non-theistic viewpoint would suggest a long, long time ago. Many different lines of evidence from science suggest that the Earth is far older than a few thousand years. Observational evidence from astronomy, for example, suggests that objects we see in the sky are so far away that light, the fastest possible speed in the universe, would not have had time to reach us from these distant objects if the universe were only a few thousand years ago. In the northern hemisphere, if you look up in the night sky, the constellation Cassiopeia, pointing toward the constellation of Pegasus, you can hip hop on the stars and get to an object known as the Andromeda Galaxy, which by measurements that have been made is somewhere around potentially 2 million light years away. Light traveling for 2 million years, how does that fit into the idea here of recent creationism? Well, several approaches have been used to handle this apparent conflict between the texts strongly suggesting several thousand years ago and scientific disciplines that are suggesting long periods of time. First, a very common approach that you'll hear is that the universe is not really old. Scientists are not mistaken. And so in this case, to explain starlight visible from galaxies or stars that are too far away to have had their light only reach us in a few thousand years, it's been proposed in some quarters that light traveled faster in the past. If light were traveling 2 million times faster than it is today in the past, then the light from the Andromeda Galaxy might have been here in just a couple of years. That certainly would get rid of the need for an old universe if you had light traveling faster in the past. It's also suggested simply that the stars and galaxies are really not as far away as scientists propose, that they're really much closer. The standard candlestick astronomers will refer to for trying to measure distances is mistaken. Well, that's certainly a possibility, but if you get to a distance that doesn't require any real assumptions other than the speed of light, which we just talked about, that's beyond 10,000 light years away, then having galaxies be closer than 2 million light years away isn't really going to help. If you establish something that is 15,000 light years away or 100,000 light years away, it's still further than 6,000 to 10,000 years at the speed of light being what it is now. And so arguing against the distances being wrong is only a help in certain possible situations. The problem with these approaches is that there is good observational evidence that the speed of light has not slowed down. You can find these online. Supernova 1987A, which was in the Large Magellanic Cloud in the southern hemisphere, pretty much from geometry now has indicated that it does appear to be approximately a large number of light years away, more than 100,000 light years away. So what do you do with that might be the question. There's also very good reasons to think that astronomers, in fact, have a pretty accurate idea of how far away the stars and the galaxies are. Okay, this is one approach that is taken to try to resolve what appears to be a conflict, but this one has a lot of evidence against it. That's how I think I would leave it like that. In addition, some individuals take issue with age usually given for the Earth by concentrating on the assumptions that geologists and geophysicists make when making their estimates. Radioactive decay is usually something that'll be kind of zeroed in on. But if the universe itself has distances further away than light could possibly have taken to get the information here in 6,000 to 10,000 years, then arguing on the age of the Earth isn't going to help a whole lot. The approach to deal with this recent creations problem, right, where the things appear further away or older, to me, potentially creates additional problems, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago. If you remember, we talked about arguments that are put forward that turn out to be incorrect and that make Christians look like they don't know what they're talking about. And unfortunately, many times that will happen They're badly formed, but they take hold among congregations and Christians who are unaware of their flaws or who have not taken courses to learn how to understand when something is not set up properly. Not everybody knows everything. And if something sounds like, wow, this is what we've been looking for, because that'll really stop all these arguments about how old something is, it sounds too good to be true. Sometimes it is. So I will suggest, if you go back again a couple of weeks ago, remember Augustine's warning, where he said that sometimes a believer thinking they know will make a statement that someone who has knowledge of the subject will hear, and it just makes the Christian who's making the argument that has been disproven or is badly formed look foolish, and that can take Christianity itself, belief in God itself, down with it. A second approach that's taken is that the earth and the universe are not really old, but they can't help looking old. This does not say that they look young, but that they aren't old, but they look that way. So what does that mean? Sometimes that'll be talked about as an appearance of age view. It says that if God created the world in a poof out of nothing manner, there would necessarily be a mature look to it. But what does that mean? Think about this. This is very true. Trees created 30 feet high, poof, here's a tree, would naturally look much older than the few hours since they have been created. How old would a tree that we would see today as a few hours old tend to look? You would have the seed and it might have a sprig or some kind of sprout coming up a half of an inch out of the dirt. It's not going to be 30 feet high after you place that seed in the ground after just a couple of hours. But in this viewpoint, God saying, let there be trees, I know Genesis doesn't specifically say, let there be trees, but if he had gone, poof, here's this 30-foot tree. How old is it? 10 seconds. How old does it look? A lot older than 10 seconds. That's the approach that this is taking to say that the earth and the universe aren't necessarily old, but in some ways they can't help but look old. Since stars, for example, were created to provide the signs and the seasons for us here on the earth, that's what Genesis 1 says. If that is true and that the earth and the universe are in fact young, then the light from those stars would already have to be visible here on the earth the moment they were created. In the same way that God would have said, poof, here's a 30-foot tall tree that's a minute old. God says, poof, let there be stars. Remember, the stars also. He created the stars also. If those are going to be used by humanity here on the earth, the light would have to be visible from the stars, even if they are 4 light years away, 4.3 for the Centaurs, or further away, the light would already have to be visible. Light would look older than it really was. This view does not deny that things look old, but it proposes that an appearance of age is a necessity. It is required for items that are created full grown. Again, God created how can you create a 30-foot tree that looks like it's 30 seconds old? It would likely have bark on it. It would likely be 30 feet tall. And again, the tree we would see would be half an inch poking out of the ground at best. In this situation, however, it requires that appearances of age be necessary. They are required. Otherwise, you end up, for example, with questions like this. Think about the answer before you say yes or no. Did Adam have a belly button? You and I presumably have a belly button. Where did that come from? That implies an event where I was born from my mother, and the umbilical cord that kept me alive for the roughly 9 months Mom had me within her was used to keep me alive. And when I was born out of the womb, it was snipped. And therefore, what I have is a remnant of where that past event happened. Did Adam have a belly button? Well, if Adam did have a belly button, what purpose does that serve, right? For me, it serves as a reminder of an event that happened. Adam was not born from a woman. He was not born with a mother. So if Adam had a belly button, that would have been apparently, I can't imagine any other way to view this, as a false impression of an event in the past that never happened. I would suggest that would not be a required appearance of age, that would be an appearance of age that would not be required. So if I had a snapshot of what Adam looked like, I would not think that Adam would have had a belly button. Would a tree created in the Garden of Eden have had tree rings? The 30-foot tall tree, poof, here's a 30-foot tall tree. Does it have tree rings? If you were to cut it down, if Adam had a chainsaw, cuts the tree down, does he look? How many rings inside the tree are there? Well, where do tree rings come from? They represent growth stages in the tree over time. You go out down and cut a tree down in your backyard and you look, and if it's 5 years old, it'll probably have about 5 tree rings in it. If it's 50 years old, you can see about 50 tree rings. And some of those will be larger or smaller than others depending on the growth season. A 5-minute old tree really shouldn't have 100 tree rings in it. And so in that sense, you could argue that the tree rings would be, again, an unnecessary look of age. The fact that the tree is 30 years old would be a required appearance of age, because otherwise you're going to have, again, a half-inch tall tree 5 minutes after God creates it. So to have a tree that's 30 feet tall, it's got to look older than it really is. Having a tree that has tree rings would suggest it has been here longer than that. And so that would really be a tough swallow for some people, because it appears deceptive. It appears that God is faking things. Here's one. This is intended to be rather humorous. Please do not take offense at this. Would the wine created in John chapter 2 have had a winery label? Remember, there were water pots. Jesus told them to go and to serve from those water pots to the chief of the feast, and it's wine. The chief of the feast says, you saved the best wine to last. If he went and looked at the water pots, would they have had a winery label on it? Capernaum wine refinery, 29 AD written on the side. No, I don't think so. I think they probably look like water pots. If there had been a winery label on it when it was changed into wine, it was not at the winery in 29 AD. And so if it had a winery label that was never put on it by being distilled or formed or whatever, I would suggest that would be a false appearance of age, a deceptive appearance of age. So those are the kind of things we're talking about. And if you're going with this kind of view, the earth and the universe are not really old, but they can't help looking that way, then each appearance of age needs to be evaluated, because some appearances of age might appear deceptive. Are they? Would they be? You've got to think through these things. So as I would suggest here, there are some appearances of age that are hard to explain as being necessary. This approach to deal with recent creation's problem, and I have quote marks around that, in terms of the discrepancies between so many avenues of science and the Bible, chapter 1, having the language that certainly strongly suggests recent creation, is, I think, a much more satisfactory approach than the first approach. So if you're going to have a way of dealing with that potential conflict or discrepancy, this is one I certainly would suggest much more than the first approach. A good case can be made for the necessity of some forms of appearance of age, but there are other appearances of age that I think would be harder to explain. Here's another approach that apparently some people have taken. I really think they haven't thought through this, but it would say that the earth and the universe are not really old, but God made it look that way on purpose. I've heard somebody say it's done this way as a test of our faith. So the previous view states that some appearances of age are unavoidable. This view states that God made them whether they were needed or not, that God made some appearances of age unnecessarily. The idea back to the wine and the wedding feast in Cana, God would have put a wine label on there and required the people at the feast to understand that is not real, that Jesus had just made it. This view asserts, for example, generally speaking, that God might very well have created fossils in the ground of animals that never lived. This would suggest that God would have placed the skull of an animal, dinosaur, etc., in the ground that never lived. I have heard people say this. I would have heard people say that God essentially lifted up the rocks, shoved the dinosaur skeleton in there and said, wait till they have to figure this one out. That certainly gives the appearance and might make things look like special effects. Or to many people, again, remember, we're talking about people who do not believe originally for this class or who have doubts. If I can't believe seeing a skull in the ground as a fossil, that it was real whenever it was placed there, do you really want to introduce those kind of doubts into the minds of people? So I just strongly think this is a viewpoint or an expression of a viewpoint that has not been fully thought through. If you think about it a minute, it probably will seem deceptive to you, although some years ago, someone once told me they just thought God had a strange sense of humor. I really didn't laugh. I have heard the pain of those who are struggling with these issues in counseling that I've done with a number of people over the years. Almost all of those who believe that God created the universe recently do not believe that God buried things under the ground that people that never lived. Most agree this would imply deception. This approach to recent creation's problem, again in quote marks, is one that I would really not suggest you use. Please don't use this one, please. So what about the recent creation viewpoint? The recent creation view of Genesis provides the clearest way of interpreting the text. I could have put a period there. It does. It doesn't require any gymnastics of any way. It is the way the text reads if you sit down, open it up, and read it. It does, however, have some tough challenges from scientific evidence that would suggest that the earth and the universe are much older than this view would allow. In the same way, those, for example, who would be theistic evolutionists have to have some way of explaining it. How do you deal with Genesis 1 through 11? In the same way that those who are ancient creationists, view 3, would have to say, how do you deal with the days in Genesis 1? Those who believe that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, those who take this viewpoint, again, as the clearest viewpoint of understanding the text, would have to have some way of explaining, really should, explaining to others. We have to give a reason for why the hope is within us, how the scientific evidence is wrong or false. Some people might say, well, I don't really care what that says. I see what the Bible says, and that's good enough for me. I'm not at all suggesting that that's in any way a bad way to be. But if you're going to be in the idea of talking to people who have doubts, that is not going to help anyone who's having doubts about their faith. So this recent creation view is the choice of those who are convinced that the text of the first chapter of Genesis really only allows for sequential 24-hour days, as we've been talking about. I do think that the best position for someone who holds the recent creation view of Genesis is to take the conflict with the scientific evidence in terms of that of the mature creation, the appearance of age when it is required. However, an awareness of some problem areas, even with this view, would be helpful. Again, I strongly suggest that some humility be more present from a scientific viewpoint of those who are pushing scientific evidences and from those who think that this is the only possible answer to anything. The desire to be right doesn't always lead to the knowledge that this is the only possible answer does not always lead to constructive dialogue. So which view is correct? I was asked that this last week. I see strengths and tough areas in all of them. Remember, Genesis 1 is placed at the beginning of the Bible to show mankind, show humanity that the world in which man lives originally proceeded from the creative activity of God, that God alone, the one true God, is the creator of the world, and that creating the world, God reveals himself to be the eternal God with all the qualities that we know God has, and also to inform humanity of the noble origin of the human race, because we were created in the image of God. The true enemy of naturalism, which is what this class is aimed at, the one who does not believe or the one who has doubts and is tempted not to believe, is tiptoeing over there, if not having stepped all the way over into naturalism, atheistic evolution. The true enemy of naturalism is not specific views of Genesis 1. Although some who hold the recent creation viewpoint would argue that anyone disagreeing with them, or more accurately, really, that viewpoint, is a false teacher or does not really believe the Bible. That would include David Lipscomb and Batsell Barrett Baxter, as we talked about over the last couple of weeks. I would strongly suggest that you decide, you evaluate, you determine what you believe about Genesis chapter 1, because whatever I believe about different aspects of the existence of God is still only what I believe. The basic point of the class is to try to lead those of you who may be listening to this to come to a conclusion of what you think about the existence of God, science in the Bible, and what you will do with Genesis chapter 1. As I say here, truly the primary enemy in my viewpoint is naturalism, not someone's specific view of Genesis 1. Thank you for being part of this class. I hope to see you again next week.